Hello and welcome to the second webinar, this one jointly hosted by TBM-OPA and TBM-PPP. If you want any more information about TBM-PPP, please visit the forum and find the message for this particular seminar and either send me a direct direct message, or click on the link to the TBM-PPP website. So I'd like to introduce Chris Bishop. Chris is the Director of Flight Operations at AVEX in Camarillo. He's also the Chief Pilot for AVEX Camarillo. Very distinguished person. Chris flew for many years for Cathay Pacific. So he's a prior airline pilot. Chris also does all of the test flights and for AVEX, or at least many of them, and as a result flies a very broad range of different TBM aircraft, probably larger than any of us will do in a lifetime. And so Chris put together this presentation on interrelated system failures that also addresses some of those model-specific quirks. If you have any questions as we go through, please put them in the chat and I'll try and moderate those that are relevant in flight and pose them to Chris. Otherwise, we'll then have a Q&A session at the end. This webinar is being recorded. It'll be edited for clarity, and then it will be put up in the TBM-PPP YouTube channel, and I'm sure Misty will also post a link to it on the TBM-OPA forums. So with that, Chris, over to you, and I will mute myself and my video so that people see you and not me.
All right, well, thanks, Stu, and welcome everybody. Thanks for taking the time to join us on this. For those of you who know me already and may have been at our safety seminar earlier this year and watched this particular presentation in person. Hopefully it's not overly redundant. Perhaps it'll act as a refresher. Hopefully you've come away with some questions that we can address as we go through or later at the end. So without any further ado, let's get moving. I initially started looking at what as an airline pilot, looking for an understanding of the systems of an aircraft. An easy way to do that was to sit down with the systems description, the emergency procedures from the non-normal checklist, and the MEL. Most airline operators, in fact all of them, would have a minimum equipment list. So when you start reading in the minimum equipment list, you can see a particular system that has failed, and then what other systems have to be operating so that you can continue to operate with that failed system. So that cues you in, oh, if I've lost this system, then I've also lost this other system, and therefore I have to have these conditions met if I'm going to continue to operate. So when I looked at the TBM fleet, I thought it would be an easy way to really come up with some interrelated failures. And admittedly here, I struggled to find a large number of overlaps. But the ones that I have here were some that fit that category. So here's what they are. Before I get to the actual failures themselves, I wanted to go to the idea of how the structure of the checklists work. And if I can now get out of this, if I can go to the next slide here. Why not going to the next slide? Oh, here we go. Okay. So our discussion topics really are going to start with non-normal checklists. Kinds of operating equipment list versus an MEL. Most of you would have been familiar with the equipment required for day VFR operations versus night VFR versus IFR versus operating in icing versus operating at high altitudes. So in the POH is a kinds of operation equipment list. For those of you who may have seen an MEL or have paid the money to Jet RVSM to have obtained an MEL for your aircraft, and you can see that there's a difference in the structure, which we'll look at. I'll go through some interrelated system failure scenarios. I also wanted to talk about engine failure response and sequencing of actions. One of the things that I do when I'm flying along by myself I take a look at the glide ring on ForeFlight, and then I look at my nearest airports, and I'm thinking, what would I do if the engine failed? What would be my course of action if I were to land at that place versus this place? Would I wanted a rapid descent and then orbit over the airport that's right under me, or do I need to glide as far as possible to make it to the nearest possible airport, which may be right at the edge of my glide ring? Which checklist and in which order would I action, and what are the first, second, and third things that I need to do in order, and like, how do I prioritize that? So I thought I'd at least spur some of your thinking as to how we would address those thoughts. Then the nearest and suitable descent profiles, which I just kind of mentioned, talk a little bit about that. And lastly, let's talk about home safe auto initiation. There's for those of you in the 960 who have had the latest software update, there are some changes in what causes home safe to automatically activate. And then, of course, there's the standard ones. Understanding what would be necessary to regain your control of the aircraft if auto land was automatically activated. There's a number of items that you would need to address prior to really being ready to take over the aircraft and land, especially if you were in the airport terminal area or on final in home safe. So continuing on from that list of topics, normal checklists, of course, the POH gives you the fly the airplane directive. And despite whatever critical is happening in the aircraft, keep focus on the aircraft control. That's the imperative that they give you in all of your non-normal checklists. The next thing that I want to bring to your attention is the definition of land as soon as possible, which means land at the nearest suitable, versus land as soon as practicable, meaning nearest suitable runway with convenient facilities or with operational considerations for, let's say, crash and fire rescue, or perhaps there might be maintenance on the field that would allow you to be serviced and then continue the trip, versus stranding yourself somewhere where having any recovery might not be as convenient. Maybe you need something to take care of passengers. If you were to land at a very short field, are there any emergency services for injuries or medical services available? Those are practicable concerns. Nearest possible really does mean absolutely the airport right underneath you. I mentioned in the presentation that I did in person at the safety seminar, there was an owner who bypassed one or two suitable places to land, but his truck was located at the destination that he wanted to land at. He continued on and landed safely, but was violated by the FAA for not landing as soon as possible. So I'm not sure the definitions or the metrics that the FAA would use for something like that, but certainly something to bring into your list of considerations. Another thing that I notice when I'm flying with owners is the idea that the master caution and master warnings they're there to get our attention, and that we need to cancel them after having acknowledged what caused the caution or the warning to come up. We need to reactivate, and that's the term that's used in the POH, is that we reactivate it so that the next incurring fault will get our attention. If you leave the things blinking, more and more things could pile up that they don't get your attention. So the idea that we acknowledge what was causing the annunciation, cancel it, and ready ourselves to receive the next alert, I think is an important operating procedure. And then conditional statements. When you read a checklist, what we're looking for is the if necessary, or if power recovered, or if statement. And that allows us to decide, do we go to the end of procedure, or do we continue to the next portion of the checklist? So when you're reading the non-normal procedures, you get to a place where you'll get to a conditional statement. That should cue you to say, am I concluding the checklist, or do I need to move on because this isn't the actual end of the checklist because my conditions aren't meeting the concluding statement conditions? I brought up this list, or I should say this map, to show where there are service centers. And if you zoom in on this map, you can see if you did decide you were diverting to a place where you have a TBM authorized service center, would be convenient for getting the aircraft back up and airborne sooner rather than later. This is only, of course, if you're diverting for something that's not requiring immediate landing or land as soon as possible in the message or the checklist verbiage. All right, this is the kind of operation list versus the MEL. The day and night VFR operations, anything in all of those kinds of operations listed in the POH, it says specifically must operate perfectly according to the indicated type of use. In addition to the above equipment list, you also have flight into known icing, pressurized flight, and RVSM operations. So keeping in mind things that are going to be required for each of these types of operation must operate perfectly. As a ferry pilot or a service center pilot, I'm regularly going to retrieve an aircraft with known defects, and I have to determine whether or not I meet the conditions of operate perfectly for the type of operation. But as a discretionary departure pilot, you could really decide, is this something that I can classify as operating perfectly for the kind of operation? If, on the other hand, you have an MEL, the MEL is a generic per model list that's created by a company like Jet RVSM. And from that generic MEL, they'll build you an aircraft tail number and owner specific. You'll notice here, I've blanked out the tail number and also the serial number. And the title page of this particular MEL had the name of the owner operator. So this is specific to each aircraft tail number and owner. It also requires training and authorization before operational use. In any of these MELs, you'll notice right here where it says O and M. Those indicate there is an operational requirement. That would be a pilot procedure that would be listed here as in the MEL. And then an M for maintenance procedure, meaning there's something that a maintenance technician has to do prior to being able to operate under the conditions of this specific MEL. You'll notice that for any of us operating on a KOEL, a loss of a standby generator would be a no-go. However, under an MEL, we could operate with a standby generator inoperative as long as we meet the conditions listed here. One of the risks here is that you're given the latitude to operate with a lesser order of redundancy. That increases the operational risk because you have less system redundancy. So it requires the discretion to know, am I really not going to go into icing conditions as is listed on this condition here? Should I do this rather than can I do this should be the operating mantra when using an MEL. The interrelated system failures that I had gone and done research on, I'll kind of go through these item at a time. I won't read the list here. I'll just work my way through the list. The first one I want to go into was an actual scenario that I ran into picking up an aircraft to go do a sales demo. This was in a 960. And as I began to level at 280, the first thing I saw was a FADEC fault message. Now, the FADEC fault message was not actually a FADEC fault. It turned out what it was a static fault. So you'll see I pulled up the FADEC fault message. Not a lot to look at here. Basically, fly the airplane, land as soon as practicable. And then, of course, you're no dispatch when you get on the ground. So that came to mind when I thought of, where would I want to land if I'm going to land? So the next question was, while I'm reading this checklist, I look out of the corner of my eye and I see an IAS fault indication. So the actual indication of the fault was the IAS flag telling me that I had a static fault. So I then disconnected the autopilot because the autopilot was flying off of erroneous airspeed and altitude information. So then hand flying the aircraft, I pulled the alternate static source and flying only on the standby instrument by hand, then started to read the airspeed unreliable checklist. And as you'll see here, it says pull the check that your pitot heats are on, check your alternate static source, and then use the standby instrument only. And if the systems persist, perform precautionary approach, maintaining appropriate airspeeds. ATC told me that they saw me descending, even though I wasn't, because the static fault was giving them erroneous data. Also, my ADS-B information was faulty. So I asked for a block altitude between 24 and 280 to give myself a little leeway while I sorted out the error. Eventually, because I had VMC down to about 10,000 feet, I asked for a descent below 180, canceled IFR. While I began that descent, however, my airspeed began increasing. With a block static line, as you descend, the airspeed will increase. Well, that could cause an overspeed indication, which would cause the stability and protection to then take over, engage the autopilot, and try and pitch the aircraft up to keep me from overspeeding the aircraft. So to avoid the max speed, I reduced thrust substantially, maintained speed within the indicated airspeed range. Eventually, when I got down to about 14,000 feet, all of the ice melted and all the blockages cleared and indications returned to normal. In the meantime, as I mentioned, transponder and ADS-B data was erroneous. And then I was able to re-engage the autopilot in the nav and pitch modes when I was in that descent, because neither of those modes rely on airspeed or altitude information. So that was an example of a number of different systems tied together in a single failure. Another indication that one of our owners had was a failure of his left PFD. What he had was the screen on his left-hand PFD completely went blank. Then the autopilot kicked off, and so he was hand flying the aircraft. He tried putting the display backup button to send the information to the center MFD. That didn't allow him to re-engage the autopilot. If you read the checklist for that version of the 930, which is the legacy 930, not the NG, it recommends what you do is press the offside display backup button and then transfer, and then you can regain the autopilot. In his case, he was not able to regain the autopilot using the normal onside, and so I've tried this in a number of aircraft, even as recently as yesterday and today, and it really is dependent on the software version of the aircraft and whether you're in a G1000 or a G3000 Legacy versus a G3000 NG. In a 940 and a 960, in both cases, the autopilot remained engaged. It was a simple onside display backup button to bring your data to the center MFD. I tried it in an 850 non-NXI, and it kicks off the autopilot right away. However, a simple transfer and a offside display backup to bring the center MFD data, and the autopilot was able to be re-engaged. The autopilot functionality should be able to be regained in almost all scenarios, unless you also have an AHRS failure. In the event of a GIA failure on the number one side, auto throttle is definitely going to be lost. If an AHRS has failed, autopilot is lost for good, regardless of which AHRS has failed. This is a picture from yesterday in a 940 with the PFD number one circuit breaker pulled. You can see that I've also lost my GTC number one. In this particular case, the autopilot is still engaged. So all I had to do was onside display backup and bring my data to the center screen. And I never did regain my GTC number one until recycling power on the aircraft. An interesting scenario. This did not happen in a 960. I also just tried it today in a 930 NG, and it did not give me the loss of the GTC. So really software dependent. In this particular scenario, I've kind of given you an outline of everything that's on each of the GIAs, and you can see that there's a lot of different interrelated systems connected to the GIA. So the GIA is not a single unit all by itself. What it is it's a combination of circuit breaker boards plugged into a processor. So you could lose individual components. So to say you're losing the GIA is a bit of a misnomer in the sense that it isn't a single unified piece of equipment. However, you'll see here that the AHRS number 1 can feed its on-side GIA. It can also here feed its off-side GIA. However, losing either of the AHRS does cause a loss of the autopilot. If you end up with a both-on AHRS X message, chances are that you will have lost the autopilot and won't regain it. In the event of components or an entire loss of the GIA number 2, you can see there's a number of items that you would lose along with that GIA, including your NavCom number 2, your transponder number 2, the TAWS, home safe, and the autopilot drops off and you'd need to accomplish a transfer. If you were transferred onto the number 2, you'd need to transfer back. An unlikely scenario, I'm sure, for most of you. Here's the AHRS failure checklist. As you can see, we get to a place here where we're going to have a conditional statement. Continuing, if both AHRS 1 or 2 is enunciated or not associated to heading, pitch, or roll, the PFD 1 and 2 sensor soft keys reset, and then if the enunciation checks off, then you can use the autopilot normally. So follow the checklist, look for your conditional statements, and if you meet certain conditions, you then could regain your autopilot functionality. I'll leave it to you guys to really kind of read through the checklist and kind of verify that you're following the logic. Sometimes it is a little bit obtuse. Another failure that we had, one of our owners reported that their ice detection fail CAS message came up. The boots continued cycling. The inertial separator was stuck in the on position. Windshield de-ice was on, and the prop heat stayed on. All of these systems are allowed to operate continuously. As you see in the note, it says in case of failure, they'll be forced on for the remainder of the flight. There's no time limitation on the use of the de-icing systems. In his particular case, if the windshield's overheated, the overheat mechanism should cause them to shut off while they're in an overheated condition. So that would protect you from an overheat. The prop heat, when you get to the shutdown, normally we wait for the AUX boost pump before turning the master off. I would recommend, if you had this condition, as soon as you shut down, within 15 seconds, go ahead and shut power off so that you don't overheat the prop de-ice blankets and cause a delamination, potential for delam on your composite propeller. In most cases, this fault has reset after a power cycle of the aircraft. So that's the one admonition I would offer on this particular failure, is just make sure that you get the power cycled off before you exceed 15 to 20 seconds with the propeller not spinning and cooling the prop heat blankets. For those who have an older aircraft, if you had a legacy 850 with a GDL-69A, in that version of the aircraft, they didn't have enough ports to plug in everything. So the weather radar, the only port that they had available was on the GDL-69A instead of the GIAs in that aircraft. So this serial number range is, if your aircraft is affected by this, if the GDL-69 were to fail, you would then also lose your weather radar. If you're getting your XM weather via the GDL-69A, which is where you would get it, you'd also lose your XM weather. The only weather that you would then have available to you would be the FISB weather. So if you're lucky enough to have an ADS-B in transponder that brings in your FISB weather data, that's how you would have weather in that particular failure scenario. Probably not all that prevalent for most of you. However, for the serial number range affected, I kind of want to make sure and mention this. All right, we also had an issue recently, actually more than one, where we've had a landing gear control box overheat issue. There was a service bulletin, and there's a thermal switch that was limited to 140 C that was causing the problem, and it disabled the entire landing control box. So putting the gear down using the normal method was not working. So it required resorting to a manual extension. The first indication people were getting was that their climb performance was not what they expected it to be, meaning either full or partial gear retraction, leaving landing gear hanging out in the wind, causing them reduced climb performance. If after testing it with the lights test button, your lights are not coming on, that indicates that the box has failed. So Daher's flight information letter, emergency landing gear extension procedure, reminds you of the necessity to perform that procedure if in any doubt. So we had an owner who was flying along, was having the limited performance because the gear was still hanging out. The lights were not coming on when he pressed the buttons on the box. To keep him from having to continue to a service center, after reminding him that this procedure was necessary, we also then suggested pulling the landing gear circuit breaker, the landing gear signal breaker, and the landing gear control breaker. And that reset power to the box, which then allowed normal operation. This is not a recommended procedure. I leave it entirely to your discretion if you wanted to go outside the box. It's a bit off the reservation, and I can't, as a service center representative, make a recommendation, but I'm advising you that this exists for your own discretion. The CYA from Daher is thou shalt use the emergency landing gear procedure if any questions exist. If you are affected through the serial number range 1533, this replacement fuse, I believe, is part of the procedures being implemented as the aircraft come in through normal cycles of service evolution. Any of you guys flying an aircraft or a TBM for any length of time will be familiar with this concept of the drain holes on the pitch trim actuator boots. The one thing that we don't kind of talk about is what would be the first indication. Most of us would notice this elevator mistrim condition. The autopilot would normally be trimming it. If it shows this elevator mistrim condition for a length of time, that might be an indication that the pitch trim servo is holding a sustained load longer and greater than is normally accustomed, which would then trigger someone like myself. I would think automatically, let's get a control steering button push and see if the pitch trim or the pitch servo is holding a load. If so, manually trim, which would kick off the autopilot, and then I would be able to see, oh, my pitch trim is not actuating. Now try the manual pitch trim and see if that's also jammed because of a frozen actuator. And at that point, then I would want to maintain the trim speed and get myself to warmer air and melt the ice off so I could regain functionality. Not something that we're going to see very often, probably never if you've done an adequate pre-flight and you have either stripes or visible holes that you've checked during your pre-flight inspection. If you had a trim runaway, which of course is a different scenario, the autopilot trim disconnect button is the memory item, and it's listed in the box there, autopilot trim disconnect push button. Now all three trims are disconnected. Then you could turn the autopilot trim switch to off, and then autopilot trim disconnect button release. Now pitch trim is available to you with the manual trim, but the rudder trim and aileron trim would now be no longer available. So in the event that you did have an actual runaway, you'd also lose the electronic stability and protection. So rudder trim in the arrival portion of the flight, that would probably be the highest threat item in a trim runaway scenario where you've disconnected all of the electric trims for the aircraft and you're only on electric pitch trim. Another one, which is not very common, but something to consider, it shows you how many systems are tied in to one particular switch. In the event of a weight on wheel switch failure, not a big item for most of us, the Hobbs time not being recorded, but your ground fan would remain on. You wouldn't, in theory, be able to retract the gear. Your stall heat would remain in its low setting. It wouldn't go to high for in-flight. Your transponder would have to be manually switched to the on position. Cabin would not depressurize on landing. And radar, of course, most of us wouldn't concern ourselves unless it was problematic, but you'd have to turn it on or off manually. The most important one, of course, here is if you took off and couldn't retract the gear, obviously we'd be looking at returning to base right away to get this service. But I thought it was an interesting example to show how many systems are tied into this one switch. For those of you who have the electronic stability and protection, being able to turn it off, in my mind, is just as important as having it. We've had a number of owners who didn't know how to turn it off and were occupied mashing the autopilot trim's disconnect button over and over to maintain control of the aircraft when erroneous data was being sent to force the this electronic stability to kick on. So in the event that you have a G1000, it's a simple matter of going to the AUG system and then looking for setup. So it's basically AUG system setup, then setup number 2, and then you'll see this disable or enable radio button here on stability and protection. If you have a GFC 600 autopilot, pressing and holding the autopilot disconnect button on the yoke for 10 seconds will then cause the ESP off to enunciate on the display window. And now ESP is off until you re-engage the autopilot, then it automatically kicks it back on again. Or should I say enables it and arms it for future engagement. If you have a G3000, again, it appears more convoluted, but for those of you familiar with it, it's simply go to the home screen, setup, avionics settings, then scroll down and you'll see the stability and protection icon there. Simply tap the radio button to disable it. All right, that's the end of our discussion of interrelated failures. Some of it's relevant, some of it may be a bit obscure and highly unlikely. I appreciate your forbearance on listening to the stuff that is not related to your aircraft type. To the discussion about land as soon as possible versus as soon as practicable, I kind of broke this down into groups of considerations. Obviously, the first and most important is the aircraft. Let's get the aircraft to our best glide speed. That gets us the greatest amount of time to make a decision. One of the things that most of us will do is if the engine failed at 31,000 feet, we're thinking oxygen. And I didn't put that here as the very first option, but obviously if your cabin altitude is at, let's say, 9,400 and the bleed automatically, or the bleed were to stop coming in because of an engine failure, your cabin altitude is going to climb very quickly. So the first thing you're going to look for is, let's get to the best glide speed. And is my cabin uncontrollable? Is it coming through 10,000 feet? Let's get the oxygen on. For those of you who haven't really done a lot of practice getting the oxygen mask on, my recommendation is to flop the harness forward over the front of the mask and simply put the mask on your face right away. Then take off the headset, the sunglasses, and inflate the harness and pull it over your head and then release and allow the harness to hold it. But get the mask on your face first things first, and then you can arrange the harness and the headsets afterwards. So presuming that we have our best glide speed and we've got the oxygen on as required, let's turn towards the nearest airport. I'm an advocate of having the map on my my foreflight with a glide ring enunciated, showing me where I am, especially if I have a whole bunch of airports underneath me. It's not nearly as essential as when I'm operating out in that area of the country where there are fewer airports that might actually be within my glide ring. So I'm kind of keeping an eye on that as I go, especially when I know that there aren't many airports. Then let's pull our memory items out of our brain and run the memory items for the specific failure. Action the relevant emergency checklist. One of the things you'll notice on the emergency checklist or the engine failure checklist is autopilot disconnect. At what point would it be prudent possibly to have the autopilot maintaining our best glide speed and navigating us in lateral nav to that nearest airport so that we can divide our attention? I'd open that up to discussion. And then let's talk a little bit about whether we're going to VNAV our way to a high key or a low key, and I'll explain that as we go a little further. A Mayday call and a transponder set to 7700. If we're going to be on a battery for an extended period, if I know I'm looking at a longer glide range to get to the nearest suitable, do I need to look at electrical load shedding and the essential bus tie? Then let's talk a little bit about restart considerations. I have another slide where we can kind of discuss that, whether or not it makes sense to try a restart, or how many restart attempts would we be able to do. The profile could be affected by oxygen duration. Normally, we would easily have enough. Our maximum range, drift down, and what's required to enable that, versus do we want to go ahead and do a high-speed descent to get us down to breathable oxygen for our passengers who are going to be on a essentially an ambient air with mixed oxygen, not the kind of full pressured oxygen that we would have up there in the front end of the airplane. Then restart attempts, we'll talk about that. The restart envelope, I've got that listed here just to show that that's something we're going to move into and look at farther down the line in this discussion. Anything above 200, of course, that's problematic and is probably not recommended. When it comes to airport selection, I'm going to take a look at how far away it is, what weather exists at that airport, what runway configurations, what, if any, approaches. If it looks like there's no VFR between me and that airport, would I be able to shoot an approach as an engine inoperative aircraft? My airport rescue and firefighting services, medical services, maintenance services, or fuel services, depending on the failure and the reason for the diversion, those could come into consideration. Most of us have not spent a lot of time with the oxygen masks. I recommend every time you check the oxygen during your pre-flight, verify that this 100% button is in the down position. The lever down indicates 100%. If you move it to the up position, what that does is it mixes ambient air with the oxygen to extend the range of your bottle. For every emergency that we can ever conceive of, we should always start with 100% oxygen, then as needed, move to the ambient selection. In the event that you have smoke in the cockpit and you want to evacuate smoke from the goggles, you could select the emergency to on, and that would blow air, force air through the little window in the front of the nose piece into the goggles to clear smoke from the goggles. You could use this also as a pressure breathing device if you really needed pressure air during a rapid depress. Again, a highly unlikely scenario, but it's good to have the familiarity with what the features of the oxygen mask are. The auto deployment of your O2 masks, the manual says between 12,500 and 14,750. And of course, to get those passenger oxygen masks to deploy, the pilot O2 mask switch must be in the on position. You can manually deploy them by removing the little plastic cover piece and actuating the passenger oxygen switch. I test this on every test flight that we do. I verify that it automatically deploys. If it doesn't automatically deploy, then I manually deploy them. if one or two of them fail to deploy, it's good to know that the cover can be removed manually by the use of a pen or some other device to pry the cover off. It's simply attached with tension clips. And when you do, when the masks do fall, there is a lanyard that has to be pulled to get the oxygen to flow, much like the announcement you've heard on every airliner you've ever sat in the back of. Let's talk a little bit about engine failure scenario. I'm not sure if you guys have done the same as I have. I've run the thought experiment while I'm in the middle of a long flight and thought, okay, what would be my first action, second action, third action? And I have to admit, I have struggled to come up with a more or less universal series of actions. It is somewhat, I guess, what I would call scenario dependent. I would have a different set of actions at 5,000 feet than I would obviously at 30,000 feet. So one of the most important items, and I asked this at the presentation that I did in person, which one action is going to be the most critical to making sure that you have the most amount of time to make your decisions? And that is get the propeller feathered. In fact, if you lose the engine, you're soon enough going to lose oil pressure. If you lose oil pressure, the oil pressure to the propeller hub is going to diminish to the point where the springs are going to force it to feather anyway. So I may have been a little less clear on that in the in-person description of this. It's my theory that on every single takeoff, I'm going to climb at VY to 10,000 feet. For most of us, that means 130 knots. For our auto throttle aircraft with a VNAV profile of 124 knots, that would be your FMS climb for VY. 130 knots is what's on all the test flight forms that I do. So I typically climb at 130 knots to 10,000. That gives me the most amount of time to make a decision and to have some options in the departure phase of the flight. If I'm at 10,000 feet and I lost an engine, the average, let's just say for ballpark numbers, I'm going to descend at 1,000 feet a minute, engine inoperative. That gives me 10 minutes. All right. If I have, if I'm descending at 120 knots and I'm losing 1,000 feet a minute, that means I'm going 2 miles for each 1,000 feet. That means I've got 20 miles. So having that type of ballpark number in your head to give you an idea, in case you're not looking at your glide ring, I kind of like to have that thought process at least thought through once or twice. Getting the engine feathered, in essence, I need to decide right away or pretty close, am I going to manually feather the engine? And how many of you guys have thought about the startle factor? If I make that decision to bring the condition lever to cutoff, or the thrust lever over into the feather channel and then to cutoff, that seems rather drastic. I need to make sure that I've actually got an engine failure. So how can I best determine that? What indications give me that failure? Well, obviously, if the NG is spooling below 50%, if my fuel flow is diminishing to near zero, if my ITTs are spooling down rather quickly, and then eventually oil pressure. If oil pressure dropped off the chart right away, well, obviously, we're going to lose the engine due to we're going to shut the thing down ourselves if we have an oil pressure CAS message and we read that checklist. But having an idea of what to look for, where your eyes should go in the event of an engine failure, so that you can make that decision as quickly as possible. Yes, let's get it feathered. And then after I've run the checklist, can I go into a restart scenario possibly? Under what conditions would I attempt to restart, and what cause of the failure? Then, of course, my high key and low key, am I going to be able to get myself set up for a landing on an airfield, and how do I go about doing that best? Let's take a look at some of the high key and low key stuff here in a minute. If your shutdown is unexpected, as in a flame out, low fuel pressure, fuel filter clogging, fuel tank vent clogging, there's a chance that I might have a restart. If, however, it was checklist directed, or such as an oil pressure failure, excess oil temperature or engine fire. Chances are I'm not going to be doing a restart. So that kind of excludes that whole portion of my thought process. Optimal altitude, 15,000 or below. If it's your max range 120 knots. If you are doing a max rate descent, up to 200, if you're running enough ram air into the engine, you could do it start a restart at a higher altitude. I have had the discussion with a number of people about how many restarts would we expect to be able to complete, depending on the health of the battery. I've seen a full engine motoring followed by a 1 minute cooling and then another engine start, and the battery is in great shape. So you might be able to perform more than one engine relight. But again, depending on what the cause of the shutdown, you may or may not be successful. If the battery life is just barely getting the thing started in the first place on the ground, well, maybe you're only going to get the one attempt. That's a kind of more an empirical situation, something that would be best left to your own individual aircraft, I guess. You'll notice here I've got two different speeds listed. They're showing on the chart about 160 knots, from 20,000 down to 15. Decreasing linearly. Even here, they're showing at 140 knots at 15,000. If I'm in a max range glide at 120 knots, well, chances are I'm going to need to be somewhere below 15 at least to get an acceptable restart. I'm not sure how many of you guys have heard this high key versus low key discussion. I'll kind of go through briefly for those of you who had. I hope it's not too redundant. The objective would be beam the landing threshold on the downwind at 1,500 feet with an expectation that at this point you'd go gear down first notch of flaps and start a 180-degree turn to the runway. Somewhere here on the base or short final, when you've assessed that you are definitely going to make it to the airport, that point you could go to full flaps. So many of you that have tried this in the simulator, and you know that this is a fairly good approximation. And in some cases, you end up having to side slip to make sure that you land somewhere before the first half of the runway. Having done this in the simulator and having tried it in real life, I can say this does work. So if I end up over the top of the airport, let's say at 3,000 feet, arriving at the threshold of the runway, a 180-degree turn started at 3,000 feet should put me at exactly my low key position. In the event that I arrive at the high key position at, let's say, 5,000 feet, I don't have enough to make a full 180, so I could simply fly straight ahead for 1,000 feet, make my turn, and then fly straight ahead for 1,000 feet, and I will have taken the difference between the 3,000 feet and my current altitude of 5,000, cut it in half, go outbound for half of it, go inbound for half of it, and I'll arrive back here at my low-key position exactly on altitude. That logic works also. I've done this multiple times in the simulator. So giving yourself this idea of I'm going to go to that nearest airport and I'm going to orbit over the top of the airport until I arrive at my high-key position. Okay, now how many thousands of feet? Oh, I've got another 4,000 to lose. Well, I can make another orbit and lose 3,000 more feet, right? And so now I'm arriving only 1,000 feet above that 3,000 foot, go outbound half of it, 500, come back 500 inbound and arrive at my low key position. Any questions on that, feel free to put them in the comments or the discussion afterwards. Again, going to this idea of orbiting down over the airport, should I do this at 120 knots to give myself the most amount of time to run my checklists, to make a Mayday call, to get my passengers briefed and have everything really wrapped up and good to go? I may need that max range just to get to that high key or low key position. All right. In the event that there's no other options but to go to that max range drift down, my oxygen is a consideration. The pros for going to a max range drift down would be it's necessary for an on-airport landing. It may be necessary for terrain clearance. It gives me more time to prepare and maybe get emergency services on site. It gives me more opportunities to do a relight if there is a condition suitable for that. If I had to do an instrument approach, maybe the weather is better at this farther away airport. Maybe they've got an instrument approach that's in line with the runway I intend to land on. And then maybe I can use my vertical planning tools. I can set a VNAV altitude constraint that gives me some kind of idea of how to navigate vertically to that high key or low key position. The argument against the max range drift down would be oxygen consumption. I may not have enough oxygen for all the passengers. Medically, I may have older people or children, or for those of you with small dogs, that may prohibit really exposing them to, a 20,000 foot cabin for an extended period of time. My battery consumption, I may need to get onto an essential bus tie and shed some loads. So that might be a consideration against a max range drift down. And then, of course, if I'm in icing conditions, I'm exposing myself to greater icing without being able to run any icing protection. So these are some of my considerations as to whether I would do a high-speed descent or a long-range drift down. If I had smoke or fire, that would certainly force me to make a maximum speed descent, even if the engine was not failed. If the engine failure checklist or the A checklist was forcing me, like an oil pressure, to checklist directed engine shutdown, that would be another reason to get myself down, hit it on the ground sooner than possible. A medical emergency with somebody in the back with a heart attack, for example, if the oxygen system was malfunctioning. If I had to do a high-speed descent, am I impaired due to some structural limitation of the airframe? That may change my considerations about how quickly and at what speed I'm going to descend. If I had to do a engine fire or cabin fire, max speed descent, maybe do a little of an experiment. Next time you're up at a high speed, level the aircraft and count how many minutes or how many miles it takes you to decelerate from, let's say, 230 knots to decelerate to 120. Try timing that to see how long it takes to slow an airplane down. I've kind of given you some ballpark numbers. If I was doing VMO to a high key position and I leveled off 2 miles prior, would I then arrive at my high key position at 120 knots? If I was trying to arrive at the low key position, maybe I'd give myself 3 miles to decelerate. And this is with an engine and the engine feathered. If it's engine operating, partial power, I could go VMO to an 8-mile final and then configure on speed, meaning as soon as I'm slow enough for gear and flaps, so gear and first notch, as soon as you get down to 122, then final flaps. And so you're configuring as your speed limitations allow. So kind of keep this idea in mind and maybe do a little experimenting to increase your ability to kind of gauge how long does it take to slow the aircraft down with the engine at flight idle, or simulate zero thrust with about 4% torque indicated. Again, this gives you at 120 knots about 2 miles per thousand. I did this on a test flight one day, and my actual rate of descent with a simulated zero thrust up at 300 was about 1,100 to 1,300 feet a minute. And down at below 10,000 feet, I was getting about 1,200 feet a minute. So you can use a ballpark number of 1,000 feet a minute, knowing that that's you need to buffer that with a little bit of a cushion. I kind of ran the thought experiment as well. What if I had to shoot an approach? If it's IMC and I've got no other choice, could I arrive at the final approach fix as a glider and have an altitude that would allow me to continue to glide above the glide path on the final approach course, hopefully break out before minimums and be in a position to go gear down, flaps down, and land the airplane? So I did some simple math. If I was descending at 1,000 feet a minute, that means I'm doing 500 feet per mile, right? So 2 miles per thousand at 120 knots. So 500 feet per mile. So if I had an 8-mile, as I do here, an 8-mile final approach fix, I'm just going to simply double that and say 4,000 feet. So if I arrived at my final approach fix at 4,000 feet as a glider, in theory, I should be able to glide and arrive at the airport with those numbers. But that, again, is based on 1,000 feet a minute. So maybe you'd want to buffer that by another 500 or 600 feet. Again, let's hope none of us ever end up in this scenario, but I couldn't help myself. I just kind of had to come up with an idea of whether I could do it or not. The scenario that I started off this discussion with was I have an airport right underneath me that's not a particularly good airport. This small airport here, Baker, it's right on the edge of the restricted airspace out here by Edwards and all that in the desert. But I have Daggett right out here at the edge of my glide ring. So the question begs, can I go to Daggett? Can I glide there? Yes. Should I go land here at Baker, which I believe is only like 2,200 feet long? Is it suitable? Could I do it? Yes. Does it make sense for me to do that? Eesh, that's really a judgment call. Would the FAA look favorably upon my choice to glide to Daggett? A very interesting question. So this is there's the Daggett information. I could easily VNAV to it. You can see that it's within the range of my glide ring. It is on the edge of the glide ring. So does this accounts for wind at my current descent rate in theory. But again, this is one of those judgment calls that I think we all as aviators need to kind of keep in our back pocket. How would I make this decision? What would be the best course of action? What are the pros and the cons? But I'm running this kind of thought process when I start running out of options, as I was here. Again, I've drawn the picture with a simulated glide ring showing there's my closest option. This one here is private and it's only 1,700 feet. I don't think I have it here, but Baker, I think, was 2,200 feet. So there are approaches into Daggett, and I ran this scenario in the simulator, and I easily made it and shot the approach and landed it with down to minimums IMC, again, in the simulator. So take that with a grain of salt. Your engine failure checklist, obviously your memory items. Switch the tanks, aux boost pump to on, auto throttle, autopilot disconnect. Well, I'm not sure about you guys, but one of my memory items that I would want to add to this in a 940 or 960 airplane is ignition on. The 940 and the 960 aircraft, the auto ignition position of the ignition switch has an engine spool down detection feature, meaning if your NG spools below 50%, ignition will automatically come on. Any aircraft below that set of serial numbers, the ignition will only come on if the start switch is engaged. So if you had a flame out for whatever reason, you've had a fuel starvation issue because you've got, let's say, a fuel tank vent has clogged and you've developed a suction in the left tank. Now you switch to the right tank, but by now the flame has gone out on your engine. So you switch tanks, you put the aux boost pump on. If you turn the ignition on, now you've got fuel and now you've got an ignition. I might be concerned about bringing the thrust lever to idle and monitoring for an ITT, but at least that would get the flame back up and running again. So why don't they include that? That's a question for Daher. You guys can give me your feedback and let me know if you think I'm kind of going one step beyond. But to me, that's prudent and makes a little bit of sense. I'm curious to hear your commentary on that. Let's go ahead now, I guess, and discuss home safe auto initiation and recovery. The new SB and the software in the 960, there is a pilot inactivity detection system. and the conditions are listed here. 30 minutes of inactivity, you'll get a CAS message. 3 minutes later, if you don't do something, you'll get a caution message. And then 3 minutes later, you'll get a warning, and then eventually home safe activation. So if you get the home safe activation, now you've got to answer ATC's questions about who's declaring a mayday. In the event that you have your emergency descent mode activated, the aircraft will automatically set your heading bug will move 15 degrees, or sorry, 90 degrees to the left, and you will start a turn to that heading bug. It will set 15,000 as your target altitude, and it'll hit flight level change at 165 knots, and it will start you down. Once you capture 15,000 feet in EDM, you have 15 seconds to disable EDM, or home safe will activate. If you have ESP, activate because you have exceeded the ESP limits, and you get an automatic activation of ESP in level mode. You have 2 minutes to disable, or sorry, to change these modes to heading and altitude or some other mode besides level. After 2 minutes, home safe auto land will automatically activate. So knowing what causes these things to activate, that's something that's not as well briefed perhaps. In the event that you do have an activation of home safe, you obviously will get this splash screen on the center MFD, which will then give instructions to the passengers in the event that you as the pilot are incapacitated. But these are all the systems associated with that. This kind of goes to our interrelated systems discussion earlier. You can see that it really brings in a lot of different systems that you will eventually have to regain control of if you decide to take control of the aircraft. So I'll let you guys read the slide for a second, and I'm happy to share this if you guys would like, or I can point you to where this is listed in the G3000 Pilot's Guide. In the event that you decide that you're feeling better and you'd like to recover, or that it was inadvertently activated, this is what's recommended for you to do before taking control of the aircraft. Well, control it using the PFD for primary flight control and indications. Check your altimeter setting, that may have been changed. Check the flap position. If the auto land has put the flaps down partially or fully, you'd want to match the lever to the flap position. Same thing for the gear. You'd want to set your flight director modes to what you would like, because the auto land system will have set it to what it deems necessary. That would probably be in GPS and VNAV, or it could have been in approach mode already. If you're recovering the aircraft and you want to switch it to your control, taking your own mode selection would be necessary. Check your active and standby radio frequencies, because it will have been broadcasting Mayday on 121.5. And your flight plan, of course, will have been changed, because it will have set your new destination where it's chosen to go shoot and approach and land. So it doesn't recommend that you do this on short final. Here is the checklist for home safe deactivation, including aircraft config mismanagement. There's another checklist in there that one would want to take a look at to verify you've completed all of the required steps to take control of the aircraft again. So I've kind of put together a list of items here. Again, you could read the list there. I kind of put together what I thought was a reasonable sequence of actions, but re-engaging invalid modes, using roll and heading for the lateral course, selecting your if you have an LOI indication, and if it's in dead reckoning mode, deselect the current vertical mode and display pitch as the active vertical mode. I think this is this doesn't relate necessarily to home safe. If for some other reason you had lost the auto flight control system. I'm not sure how many of you guys are familiar with or use controllable steering. I personally consider that to be an essential feature for for aircraft control and managing the auto flight control system, and also just for checking the trim condition of the aircraft, and also learning how to disable the stability protection, when to have it on, when to have it off. In most cases, you guys will probably never need to turn it off, but again, understanding the aircraft fully is part of good airmanship, in my opinion. I believe that covers all of the discussion topics. I'll open it up for any questions.
So, Chris, there were two questions, one from Tom McGrath relating back to the failure of the ice detection system and the ice control box failure. And the question is, would you recommend pulling the circuit breaker for the prop heat if the box had failed? And assuming that the temperature on landing is greater than 0 Celsius, the concern is forgetting to shut down quickly in the urgency of the event.
Actually, you know, Tom, that's a great suggestion. I should have thought of that. Excellent idea. I think that would that should be in the checklist procedure, or that should be, you know, if they come out with an SB, it wouldn't surprise me if they suggest, yes, deselect the circuit breaker so that there's no chance you're going to overheat the prop. I wish I had thought of that.
Okay, and then the second question from Van Anderson. Has anybody ever confirmed the accuracy of ForeFlight's glide ring?
That's a good question. It reads it out as a 13.8 to 1. So if there's a mathematician out there amongst us, 13.8 feet forward for each 1 foot down. So what does that equate to in miles per thousands of feet lost? So, I mean, you could do the math on it, and that's what it's calculated. If you look in the bottom right-hand corner where it tells you what that is, or when you go to select a glide ring on or off in the aircraft configuration, or in the configuration in ForeFlight, it tells you what the ratio is. Hang on a second, I'll see if I can pull that up. But if indeed it matches approximately 11 to 1,200 feet a minute, then I would say yes. I'm not going to get a glide ring here because I'm not airborne.
So the glide ratio is actually part of the aircraft setup?
No. It's if you go to ForeFlight and you're looking at the map, there's a little gear icon and it gives you settings. If you go down to glide advisor, and it's a button you can slide on or off, below that it says glide settings at 120 knots, 13.8 to 1. So that's something that could be set in ForeFlight. You could tell it, oh, I don't agree with 13.8 to 1. I think it should be, you know, 12 to 1, or you could change the settings to make it more conservative if you wanted. If you pull up ForeFlight, and you can see right there in the settings where it allows you to make that selection.
Okay, it's good advice. And then one other question from Tom. You plan to climb at VY, agree with that, but have you thought maybe VX 100 knots would be better for the impossible turn for a couple of thousand feet?
Again, not a bad idea. I would say at least, you know, most of us are going to follow the scenario that you know, what I consider to be standard SOP, and the guys at Simcom kind of say, oh, well, you guys figure it out and do what you guys think is most appropriate. In my mind, every takeoff should be the same. It should be positive rate out of usable runway, gear up, yaw damper. And then when the gear is in the well, flaps up, flight level change, bug speed, and usually that would be 130 knots, or you could select FMS if 124 was automatic, it was preset before departure, and then heading select. So right there, when the gear comes up and I go flaps up, flight level change, that's happening at full thrust at 10 degrees of pitch. And almost every single time you're going to be at about 110 knots to 115 knots with full thrust and 10 degrees of pitch. So that would mean I'd be climbing in that configuration with, in other words, go flaps up and continue climbing at 115 knots. Isn't VX, what is VX? Isn't it 100 110?
100 knots. Yeah.
100 knots, sorry. I should know that. I never climb at it, so I'll give myself a pass on that one. 110 knots to at least 1,000 feet. I guess that's, if I had a concern about whether or not I could make that impossible turn, yeah. I don't know how many. I leave it open to discussion. I'm going to say I'm going to do my normal procedure of flaps up, flight level change, bug 130 knots, and climb at 130 knots to 10,000 feet. Maybe if I really thought there was a concern, if I thought I had a need for it, maybe I would do it. But I guess I'm going to leave too much faith in the equipment to my answer on that one. But Tom, I like your thinking.
Okay, well, I think that ends the questions. I'd really like to thank you, Chris, for taking the time to run everybody through this very solid presentation, and appreciate it very much indeed. Yeah,
I hope you guys didn't find it overly redundant or pedantic.
That's great. Thanks very much, folks.
All right, thanks, guys.